Dr. Pierre-Yves is a research director at INRIA and head of the INRIA and Embodied Tech Flowers team in France. Before, he was a researcher in Sony Computer Science Laboratory for 8 years. And he studied theoretical computer science at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon and received his PhD in artificial intelligence from University Paris 6 in France. He has been studying lifelong autonomous agents and self-organization of behavioral, cognitive, and cultural structures at the frontier of AI, machine learning, cognitive science, and educational technologies. He has also been developing models of intrinsically motivated learning, pioneering curiosity-driven learning algorithms working in real-world robots, and developing theoretical frameworks to understand better human curiosity and autonomous learning. He has received numerous prizes for his works in developmental robotics and on the origins of language. In particular, he is the laureate of the INRIA National Academy of Science Young Research Prize in Computer Science and of an ERC Grant Explorers. He has also given several invited lectures and international conferences. In particular, probably many of you remember his plenary talk at Eclair last year. And something I really like about Pierre-Yves is his breadth of work. He's involved in all the stages of the AI research pipeline, from understanding humans, then building models of intelligence and implementing them on real robots. Welcome to our seminar.
Thanks a lot for this very nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present some of our research and also later on to discuss with some of you. So indeed, I will actually reuse some parts of my talk of ICLR last year, so I'm sorry for those who were already there. But then there is also new parts that were not in the talk, especially in the second half of the talk, so I hope there will be news for you on that side. So the main topic I will be speaking about today is the concept of developmental machine learning, and I will focus in particular on the concept of curiosity, which is another term for intrinsic motivation, and link some of the work which has been initially made in my team for modeling curiosity-driven learning in humans and infants in particular, with more recent research that has been going on in DeepRL. So when we look at child learning, what we can observe is that they are really extraordinary learners, not because some of them become world champions in games like Go or chess. Actually, this happens to only very few of them. But because nearly all of them acquire efficiently a wide variety of everyday skills like moving around, building Lego structures, doing bicycle or mastering language. And what is really key is that this learning is autonomous, which means that there is never an engineer that's intervening to change some parameters or some reward functions for new tasks. There are only normal people, not engineers. And it's also developmental, as learning experiences are progressive, with a specific ordering and a specific timing. And for example, the infant first learns how to hold its head, later on to sit, to crawl, and then to stand on 2 feet, and then to walk finally on the 2 feet. And so a fundamental question is how such developmental sequences form, and what is the role of those structures. And probably such developmental pathways or learning curriculum, such developmental trajectories, we call that also developmental trajectories, which can be viewed as a kind of curriculum for learning. They are probably useful to address one of the fundamental problems of how to guide the learning of so many things under limited resources of time, of computation, and of energy. And so in my team, we study these questions along 3 dimensions. So first, we build algorithmic models to help understanding better human development. And here we collaborate a lot with developmental psychologists and cognitive neuroscience lab. Then we build and we study how the insights coming from such fundamental research can help us build more adaptive and autonomous learning machines. And then finally, we also work on some applications, especially in the domain of educational technologies. For example, we study how to personalize sequences of exercises for maximizing both the learning efficiency and the motivation, for example, for children at school, but also for older people. So today I will not talk about applications in educational technologies, but know that it's an important part of the application domain of all the concepts I'm going to speak about today. So basically, we organize our research by studying several families of developmental forces that guide and constrain learning in infants. So the first family that we've been studying is the role of body morphology and the progressive growth of the body. So probably many of you, since the seminar is called Embodied Intelligence, are already very, very familiar with the importance of the geometry, of the structure and the materials of the body for simplifying learning problems in living animals and humans in particular, but sometimes in robots. For example, if the design of the body is badly done, maybe it makes the problem much more complicated than it should be. For example, it's well known about the work of passive dynamic walking that if you design well the morphology of the robot, then spontaneously, even without computation, even without an external source of energy, you can have a spontaneous generation of a gait, which is already rich and organized, and learning to walk is about learning to perturb this gait. And this can considerably simplify the understanding and the building of controllers, as opposed to working with, for example, with a big humanoid with a big rectangle in the chest. That's practical to build, to put the battery and the computer, but that's not at all practical for making the control problem easy. But another dimension of this is also maturation, which is something that's very important in animals and in humans in particular, is that, for example, the sensory motor system does not begin full-blown. The sensory system, for example, begins by being relatively raw, with coarse visual perception, coarse touch, coarse smell, and also the motor apparatus grows progressively, like the resolution of spatial and temporal command that we can send to the muscles is initially relatively coarse, and it progressively unfolds with time. And so those mechanisms are quite important to constrain the set of problems and the set of actions, for example, that learners can access and learn to solve, and that's important in development. So I will not talk about that today, but no, it's really part of our thinking. There is another family of forces which is very important, which are cognitive biases, which basically is the fact that there are a number of key representations, what some people have called core knowledge, that are either innate or learned very early on during the life, and on which later cognitive development and learning is strongly relying and building on. So, for example, when human infants begin to learn language, it has been a very long time that they have already developed a very rich and structured visual representation of the world organized along objects, for example. So they have object-centered representation, and even more than this, they have affordance-centered representation, which means that when they view an object, they perceive it not only as an object, but in terms of what is the repertoire of actions that apply to this particular object and how the object is going to react to the sensory motor system. And language is built on top of this. So that's very important, because sometimes, and we'll speak about that later on in the talk, you see in the current work in artificial intelligence, people trying to have machines learn language. For example, deep reinforcement learning systems learn language by starting from pixel perception of the world. So this might be like an interesting intellectual problem, but this has nothing to do with the way children learn language. When they learn language, they already have object-centered representations for a very, very long time. And there are other important cognitive biases that are very important. For example, like children very early on have an organized representation of social peers, like they are persons and they have intentions with a certain structure. So another thing is that we also study the family of developmental forces related to social learning, which is a way to leverage culture and to leverage the learning and the discoveries that have been achieved by generations of individuals before the baby comes to the world. And that's obviously very, very important. And last of the forces, and I'm going today to focus on this force, is like what psychologists have called intrinsic motivation, and what in everyday language we may call curiosity. And I'm going to show you in 1 second a video to really show you what I'm talking about. And today I'm going to focus on this family of mechanisms and also explain some of the links it has with social learning and cognitive biases. So here we can look at a video to explain what I mean by intrinsically motivated exploration. So well, here we see this little guy. He's apparently alone, he's not hungry, he's not thirsty, and there is no parent around that has provided to him an external instruction or a task. So from a rational point of view, one may think that if the evolutionary fitness of this guy is to grow up and reproduce, then he should probably keep safe and avoid putting his finger in the plug, for example, and do nothing and wait his parents provide him with food when he will become hungry. But this is not at all what he's doing. He goes for the fingers in the plug, he explores his body, tries to grasp, push, test, throw all objects around. And actually, he does that not so much in a randomly way. He does this in a pretty organized manner. There are objects which he plays with, some other he does not play with, and he uses his fingers in a very peculiar way, for example, to play with objects. And such spontaneous exploration appears to be quite fundamental in child development. And it's actually difficult to avoid that children do this. They really always do that. And actually, psychologists began to discuss such curiosity-driven explorations already in the 40s and in the 50s in the last century. And they hypothesized that the brain contains some kind of neural circuits that push infants to be intrinsically interested by things like novelty, like surprise, like cognitive dissonance, intermediate novelty, or optimal challenge. So, however, a limit of this line of work has been that these hypotheses have remained really at a verbal level. They've not been very precise. They have been vague. And most of the work in psychology that has been done in the second half of the 20th century has actually focused on the impact of being intrinsically motivated in the context of classroom learning. So that was more like in the context of educational sciences. And actually, up to 20 years ago, there was really very little research on the operational mechanisms of curiosity in the brain, and very also little work thinking about how one could model this with machines. For example, how could we build robots equipped with some forms of curiosity-driven learning? And so there was a few labs in the world 20 years ago that began to investigate those questions, but I was part of them with my colleagues, and I can tell you that 20 years ago, if you went to a conference and whether it was in AI or in neuroscience or in developmental psychology, and you were at the social dinner, and then you began to speak about the fact that you would really study curiosity as a research topic, like, it was really a way to be kind of nearly impolite, like saying you're not doing any kinds of serious science, and everyone was looking at you with very big eyes. So that was really a fun time to be in this period. And basically, there are a few labs in the world coming from different lines of research who have progressively come to get interested in trying to study curiosity-driven learning. And in the subfield of people who've been trying to build algorithmic models of curiosity-driven learning, there has been actually several independent lines of research we have developed. So, for example, the line I came from and the way I came to studying curiosity and develop the mechanisms I'm going to describe you today is initially from the point of view of cognitive modeling and theoretical biology. And I was basically inspired by the work of Francesco Varela and Umberto Maturana, who developed a theory of autopoiesis for explaining the way organisms maintain the organization of their own body. And there was something that was bugging me with their theory, is the fact that this was a theory of homeostasis, like organism, and in particular the human brain, was thought of an organism which tries to maintain its equilibrium and as opposed to perturbation coming from the environment. So, for example, they were conceptualizing learning as a way to react of the brain to react to perturbation of the environment that would show situations that were not well predicted, and the brain would basically act so as to get information to better predict the things around. But the problematic things about this kind of view is that it does not really explain the way many animals, and humans in particular, not only react to perturbation of the environment, but they go actively for searching new things, for new knowledge, and they self-perturbate. And this is the only way actually they can really self-develop open repertoires of skills, as we see in advanced animals. If you don't have some kind of self-perturbation, there is no way actually to conceptualize correctly the development we observe in humans. So this is basically the line of thought that led us to what we've been doing recently, and that was connected through psychology, because we wanted really to develop a theory of the self-organization of developmental trajectories. But then in parallel and completely independently, there are other lines of research we developed. So in the field of machine learning and reinforcement learning, there are a few pioneers who are not so much interested in understanding humans, but who came to related ideas. So for example, you have in the field of active learning, statistical approaches that are quite similar to things I'm going to talk today. And then there are a few pioneers of reinforcement learning like Oudeyer, which was probably the first to implement and to experiment curiosity-driven reinforcement learning. And then a bit later on, so like in many domains, you have always Jürgen Spielhuber that has done early things. And then the group of Andy Bartow and Satinder Singh also began to explore those questions under the term of intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning early in the 21st century. And then in the field of evolutionary computation, you have also another line of research related to novelty search, which developed with many interesting links with the two other lines, but I think which developed also independently. And so the particular line of work we've been working on, I think has been original because we've been focusing on actually modeling curiosity-driven exploration in humans. So like trying to understand better humans has been really a motivation. And this has also explained why we have put a lot of emphasis on trying to understand what kind of mechanisms for curiosity-driven learning can be made to work for acquiring skills in a high-dimensional real world, like for example in robotic bodies, because this is really the problems human children are solving. And so we wanted to try to see how this can be solved. And also we wanted really to make the link between active learning, curiosity-driven learning, and the long-term self-organization of developmental trajectories. And so based on this early work, a lot of things changed in the last 20 years. And now it's not anymore unpolite to say one is working on curiosity-driven learning, and it's also the case in neuroscience. So like I've been developing many very rich collaboration with a number of cognitive neuroscientists and developmental psychologists, as you see on this slide. And so, for example, 2 years ago, we had a paper on curiosity, which made the cover of the Nature Neuroscience Reviews journal. So, which is really like some kind of proof that, okay, now this is a serious scientific topic. We can really discuss about that. And there is a whole community actually of researchers that has built from different disciplines. And now there are several series of conferences, and that there is one we've been building with Jacqueline Gottlieb, which is called the Neurocuriosity Symposiums, which is every 2 years since 2014. And the next one actually had to be next month in New York City, but it will probably happen later this year in New York City. Okay, so now let's go into more detail into the theoretical perspective. So basically our theoretical perspective has been to see the child as a sense-making organism, as a little scientist that makes experiments to acquire good predictive models of the world, and even more importantly, good models enabling to control the world with their actions. And so it means that on top of a standard learning architecture for discovering the regularities and build these world models, there needs to be an adaptive meta-architecture that enables them to decide what experiments to make and in which order. And so there are different kinds of experiments that children can make. There are first prediction experiments. So for example, these children on the left may try to figure out which color will appear if they mix some chemicals. But there are also goal achievement experiments. So for example, these children imagine a goal to build a high tower, and they are trying to figure out which action needs to be taken. And the key objective here is basically understanding what kind of meta-architecture can enable to learn in those high-dimensional real-world sensory motor spaces. And so to approach modeling this mechanism, we've been using a robotic playground for experimentation. And it's not so much because we are interested in robots. And actually, we don't see ourselves as roboticists, but it's because we think that dealing with robots is a way to confront to some of the real problems that are solved by human infants, which is basically how to deal with a high-dimensional body and at the same time have limited resources of time and energy. And of course, we use also a lot of simulations, but using robots regularly appears to be really a key for testing the real effectivity of the methods. So for example, on the left, we have a robot that learns basic affordances. He's learning to push pushable objects, to grasp graspable objects, and then later on he discovers how to produce sounds that basically produce certain reactions in the other guys. And on the right, we have another experiment we are going to discuss in a few minutes. And the discoveries in these experiments, they happen in a few dozen hours on the real robots and without any simulation, and using quite limited computational resources. And so, of course, it's not magic. There are some ingredients that are quite fundamental to enable this. And among those ingredients, there are a few ones that are important to have in mind, especially like if you come from a reinforcement learning point of view, they are not so common, but if you come from a robotics point of view, it's actually much more obvious. So the first thing is that just as humans, actions are controlled by structured neuromuscular synergies, which means that actions are parameters of dynamical systems which produce time-extended structure that constrain body movements. And the most typical example that we are going to use in experiments I will show is dynamic movement primitives, which are basically a set of differential equations which already contain structure. And basically deciding of an action is deciding the parameters of these dynamical systems, which will produce an organized motor trajectory. And also, just like humans, which already have developed an advanced object-based perceptual representation when they begin to learn affordances, when they begin to learn language, the robots we use, we assume they can track the outcome of their action in terms of object-centered representations. So in some experiments, of course, we try to see what happens if we start from pixels, but in many experiments, we do not start from pixels, where we assume already organized representations. Then another ingredient that is very important is, in general, is the use of self-supervised learning techniques by learning forward and inverse models of different kinds, and using a lot different forms on hindsight learning, and also different forms of episodic memory. And finally, but they have also intrinsic motivation to decide which experiments to make in what order, and this is a key question I'm going to focus here. Okay, so what's an interesting learning experiment? How do humans, children, or machines should choose what to experiment, what to spend time learning about? And so there are many ideas that have been proposed in fields ranging from psychology to biology to cognitive modeling and to AI, quite often quite independently. So one idea is that an interesting experiment is one which leads to experience of high novelty or high prediction errors. But in the real world, this kind of idea is not going to work at all, because this will lead a robot, for example, to spend its whole day staring through the window, making movements with its arms and trying to predict how the color of cars passing by the window may change as a function of its arm movements, which is of course completely stupid, but it's a good way to get a lot of prediction error. So among other ideas, I will now explain one that we've developed and studied a lot, and that was actually initially inspired by some of the limits of the theory of Varela and Maturana in biology. And that's the concept of empirical learning progress that's been shown to be very efficient for experiments in robot exploration and robot learning. So this idea is that the interestingness of a kind of experiment is proportional to empirical change in prediction errors, or proportional to change in goal achievement competencies. And this change can be an improvement, but it can also be a decrease in the competence, which will enable to drive interest to parts of an environment that change or to skills that are being forgotten. And so basically we call this idea the learning progress hypothesis, but it's actually a short hand because it's really the absolute value of the learning dynamics of the learning derivative that we look at. So we include also learning regress. And so such a mechanism can actually self-organize a curriculum of learning. So let's visualize how, by imagining a situation where we have a robot that is confronted with 4 sensory motor activities, each characterized by different learning rates, as we see on the top graph. And so each curve shows basically the evolution of the errors in each activity if the learner would focus on practicing each of them. And so if we have an exploration that's driven by the principle of learning progress, it will basically result in avoiding activities that are too easy or too difficult to learn. And it will first focus on the activity with the fastest learning rate, which is here activity number 3. And eventually, when it starts to reach a plateau, it will switch to the second most promising learning situation, which is activity number 2. And so we see really here the self-organization of different phases of learning. And this was not pre-programmed by, for example, an engineer. It's really like using the learning progress concept on top of a set of activities which have different learning profiles. But now here the problem is simplified because here activities are kind of pre-segmented and we can view in advance their learning profile. In the real world, of course, it's impossible to assume this. So beyond this general idea, the real difficult question is how to implement in high-dimensional bodies mechanism for progressively categorizing sensory motor activities and estimating online their learning progress. Okay, so in the last 2 slides, I'm showing them again. I spoke about the question. I showed what is an interesting learning experiment. And many people are focusing on this question. That's an important question. But there is another question which is just as important and actually is much less discussed in the literature on curiosity-driven learning, which is what is the structure on which one is applying the measure of interestingness. So another way to say that is how do we parameterize the learning situations? How do we parameterize the learning situation in such a way that we will use the intrinsic reward to apply to those parameters? And actually, there are many ways to do that. And the way to do that, to my opinion, is going to have an even bigger impact on the whole system than if you use an intrinsic reward based on surprise or learning progress or whatever. So what do I mean by this? So first of all, take the traditional reinforcement learning perspective or MDP perspective. Imagine you have an agent who is perceiving state S of t at any time step t, and then he may decide for an action at time t, and then he may observe the next state at time t plus 1. And then he's basically learning different kinds of model based on these dynamics. For example, a model of the transition dynamics, and he's using the model to make the prediction. And after he observes of t plus 1, then he can update his new model as t plus 1. And so when you see this, then you could imagine actually using a measure of interestingness or an intrinsic reward that's going to characterize various aspects of those terms. So for example, count-based approaches that some of you may be familiar with in reinforcement learning, they are going to basically estimate in many different ways how often one has visited particular states, and they will, for example, provide intrinsic reward for states that are visited not so often. There are variants of this where, for example, you could try to measure how well you encode or reconstruct a given state given an encoder, for example, and a decoder. Another way to use those tools is that you might not focus on, for example, the frequency in which you visit a particular state, but you might, for example, focus on the mapping between S and A at t and S at t plus 1. And you might say, one could use an intrinsic reward measure, which is going to measure surprise, prediction error, learning progress, or KL divergence of the model before and after the update. So you can imagine many intrinsic rewards. You can use the terms in a different order. For example, you might focus on the mapping between like some kind of local inverse model in time, like given S of t plus 1 and S of t, can you predict what's the action that produce that transition? And again, here, you're going to build a model to predict this transition, and you can use various kinds of intrinsic measures of intrinsic rewards to characterize, for example, the uncertainty or the surprise of what you observe. And more generally, here, you can basically invent a whole space of intrinsic reward measure, which are basically a function f that's going to take as input s of t, a of t, s of t plus 1, and basically the properties of the model before and after the observation. And the common point of all this space of measure, which basically correspond to literally hundreds of papers in the literature, is that they all focus on intrinsic reward characterizing what's happening at a very small time scale, basically like happening at between time t and time t plus 1. And this is something that's key to realize, because actually if you think about real world spaces like robotic world spaces with many dimensions, many distractors, it's actually very difficult to detect regularities and to guide exploration in those spaces using those very small timescale measures. And I would say probably it may only work if you use a slow learning machine and if you are in a deterministic environment. So maybe, for example, if you use DeepRL in Atari. Okay, that was a side joke. So that's one way to parameterize the learning situation. And also here, actually, it's not one way, but a family of ways that you see. But there are other ways. Maybe you can actually have algorithms that take a step back from the local time dynamics, and maybe you can look at the learning dynamics from a larger time scale. So let's look at a framework that allows to do this. So here we are again going to consider parameterized action policies starting from a step S. And so those action policies may be neural nets, but in what follows, they are going to be dynamic motion primitives, which provide more structure, as I said. And here it could be a robot that is a soft robot controlling the flow of air in its body for moving around, or it could be for producing a particular sound wave with its vocal tract. And so when you roll out the action policy for a certain amount of time, it corresponds literally here to making an experiment I was talking about earlier. And the raw outcome of this experiment is the full trajectories of states and microaction. But then what is key is that one assumes that the learner can compute different kinds of behavioral descriptors over this whole trajectory. So for example, this might be parameters of some kind of Bezier curve that's fitting the trajectory of one object. It could be the counting of events, of some particular events, or it could be, for example, the embedding of a recurrent neural network, which has learned to compress the full sequence. And basically from this collected data, learners can learn two kinds of models. First of all, they can learn forward models, which enable to predict the behavioral descriptors corresponding to rolling out certain policy parameters starting from some states. And so this can be done with a neural net, but it's quite often in the experiments that we do in my lab, we use rather episodic memories that are combined with online, local, nonlinear regression methods so that we can have very fast incremental learning. And then there is also inverse models, which enable to infer one or several policy parameters, enabling to produce a given target behavioral descriptors, which here we are going to call a goal. So basically a goal here will consist in aiming to generate a behavioral trajectory, which on the long term will be able to produce behavioral descriptor values that summarize some statistics, some properties of the full trajectory. So here a goal is not really just reaching a particular set, it's something that's much more general. It's any kind of properties one can define on a full trajectory. And so now, and so this inverse model basically takes as input the current state, a goal phi, and then basically is going to try to infer parameters of a policy that's going to reach that thing. And for example, you could try to directly learn this inverse model, or you could rely on the forward model combined with optimization. And then from this, the question is, how do we use learning progress, a learning progress driven exploration? For example, if we are interested into the learning progress intrinsic rewards I was speaking earlier on. So one way of applying learning progress is by measuring the speed of improvement locally in the forward models, and then sample policy parameter in subparts that have high learning progress. So that's what we call some kind of prediction progress. But there is another way of applying learning progress, which is by measuring the speed of improvement locally in the inverse model and sample goals accordingly. So what's important is that even if one misses a targeted goal, the observed outcome is useful to retrain the inverse model. And so that's a form of unsigned learning that's very efficient. And when we do that, that's what we call intrinsically motivated goal exploration. Okay, but how do we do this in more detail? So let's consider doing this with the goal achievement experiment. So here in purple, we imagine that we have a space of goal parameters phi. These are the behavioral descriptors I just described to you. And so then there is a mechanism for progressively splitting this space into subregions. And in each of these subregions, basically the learner is going to keep track of the evolution of goal achievement errors. And then he's going to make a regression model of these dynamics. And then he's going to estimate the absolute value of the derivative of goal achievement error in each of those regions. And this is what we call the learning progress. And then this measure of learning progress is basically used to decide in which region to sample goals using a multi-arm bandit that is using this learning progress as the utility. So typically, for example, we often use an X3 bandit algorithm because it's quite good for solving non-stationary bandits. And here it's the non-stationary bandit because the learning progress is a non-stationary measure. And basically, by sampling those goals in those regions that are progressively built, this is the way that is going to be used to progressively provide like learning problems to a learner, which can be of different kinds. Okay, and this is going to generate some kind of automated curriculum learning. So let's see a particular experiment with a humanoid robot that can explore its body and how to interact with many objects, some of them being tools. So there are also here in the experiment I'm going to show several distractors, which means objects that are either too far to be moved or that move autonomously in a random manner. So the robot here is able to track the position, the color, and the sound of all objects. The robot can produce actions that are parameterized by 32-dimensional dynamic equation primitives. And then it has several groups of behavioral descriptors that we call modules that characterize the trajectory of various objects, as well as the sound and the light patterns produced by several objects. And in total, we have a descriptor space with 310 dimensions, organized into 15 modules, and each module has basically 20 dimensions. And so as you can see on the right, actually we have a farm of these humanoid robots so that we can make more experiments. So let's see at the video of how it is working. Okay, so basically, here you see the robot, and initially he's tracking the position of all objects in the environment, and he doesn't know which objects are learnable, which are not learnable. He doesn't know which among the learnable ones are easy to learn and which are not easy to learn. And so initially, he basically imagined random goals for all objects. And actually, there is only one space of goal which produces actually movements and which is the space of one specific object, which is the movement of its own hand, which is initially just one object among others. And so he discovers that there is a source of learning progress that's possible to make in that space. So he imagined many random trajectories he could try to make with the hand. So here what's important again is the goal are not, again, states to be reached by the hand. Goals are full parameters characterizing full trajectories of the hand in the 3D space. And so he sampled that space of trajectories with the hand. He makes learning progress. And as a side effect of this, he discovers a variety of movements. And at some point, he discovered that actually the two joysticks in front of it can be moved. And so now he discovered that there is a source of learning progress by imagining goals characterizing movements of the joysticks. So he focuses for a while on those joysticks, and actually one of the joysticks does nothing special, but the other joystick actually is plugged, linked with the white electric toy in front of him. And he discovers that this joystick is more interesting because it produces more learning progress. And then the robot discovers that setting goals about trajectory of the white toy is now interesting. There are things to learn. So he's focusing on it. And at some point, he discovers that the white toy can be used to move the little ball around. And now the little ball becomes a source of learning progress. And so at this point in time, he focuses on imagining trajectories of the ball he could try to produce with his inverse model. And actually, he discovers various ways to moving forward, backward, etc. And then there is also a mechanism. I will talk about that in a minute also. There is also a way for the robot to be guided by social peers. For example, he may ask a demonstration for certain movements. But actually, for the robot to discover how to move the ball, it doesn't need at all demonstration for the humans. It can work completely autonomously in a few hours. And it's important to realize that it's really efficient, because if you would, for example, imagine using a deep reinforcement learning systems, and even with an object-centered representation, and you would provide an external reward for moving the ball. If you would use a vanilla DeepRL system without an organized exploration method, it would literally take hundreds of years for the robot to discover. Here, there is no external reward at all. The robot is given many potential goal spaces in which he can sample, and he's self-organizing a sequence of developmental phases where he focuses on different kinds of goals, and in a few hours, he discovered how to move the ball. So now we have also tested this family of algorithms on many different robotic bodies, as you can see here. And importantly, we've extended them to deal with interaction with the social peer, as you've seen also at the end of the last video. And so the general idea is that in addition to using learning progress to select their own goals, the agent uses learning progress to decide when to ask help from the human and what kind of question to ask and how to use the provided information. So basically, agents are given the opportunity to explore humans or the social peers in general as a learning tool. And they evaluate the interestingness of these learning tools in terms of how much learning progress they provide about the environment. And so, for example, on the top right, a robot learns to manipulate a flexible fishing rod. I hope you agree it's an important task. And when he decides, he can ask a human to make a demonstration. And then after a demonstration is provided, he decides whether he used the demonstration by doing mimicry or just imitating the goal by emulation. And if there are several teachers, actually, the agent can also sample to what teacher is going to ask help by measuring the learning progress a particular teacher is providing. And so what's very important to understand here is that the agent remains fully intrinsically motivated, and he receives no instructions and no external reward at all from the human. And yet, he benefits from the human to boost learning by using the human as a tool. So the robot really is in full control, and there is no external reward. That's very important to understand. So on the bottom left, I'm going to go very fast, but just to show that we've used the same general idea also, for example, with a robot visually exploring objects to make mental models of their visual appearances and their affordances. And it can ask, for example, help to humans to show them various ways to interact with objects. Okay. But okay, I talked about DeepRL in the beginning, very fast, but in all those experiments, we don't use DeepRL techniques. We use rather quite old, but still extremely efficient self-supervised learning techniques combined with episodic memory. But of course, now in the deep reinforcement learning literature, there are many very useful techniques that are also very powerful. So how could we transpose some of the ideas I exposed to you to the DeepRL framework? And this is what actually we've been doing by starting from the goal condition reinforcement learning framework and applying those ideas. So basically, we've started we're starting from the framework of reinforcement learning that consider policies that are parameterized by goals. So I don't know to what extent most of you are already familiar with that, but I assume you are already quite familiar with that, which is actually an old idea. But I think that, for example, Leslie Kelbling, who I saw in the audience, already worked a long time ago, which was renewed with modern neural network recently through things like universal value function and hindsight experience replay. And so starting from basically this goal condition actor critique framework, we made several updates to transpose the idea of intrinsic motivation. So the first update that we made is that we have been considering modular representation of the goals that enable to represent different types of goals with different types of parameters. So that's not specific to intrinsic motivation, but that's something we already use in a robot experiment I presented to you before, and we are also using here. So for example, one may want to consider goals if you have a robot moving objects, goals of the type move the gripper to a peculiar XYZ position, or another goal of the type stack cube 1 and cube 3. And so basically to deal with different kinds of goals, we have basically a modular encoding, and it includes masking of dimensions that are irrelevant to the current goal. But most importantly, a second difference that is much more fundamental is that instead of considering that goals come from the environment, which was, for example, assumed in the work on UVFA and Insight Experience Replay, here we basically assume that the agent himself can sample in the goal space, and is going to sample using a learning progress-based bandit like in the previous models. And then the third difference is that we are not only going to use learning progress to sample modular goals to achieve in the external world, but we are going also to use learning progress to sample goals, for organizing goal relabeling for Insight learning. Basically by using a structured replay buffer organization that is mapping the space of tasks. So we have several sub-buffers corresponding to different tasks, and we are going to resample from those buffers in the goal relabeling process by using a bandit based on the learning progress idea. And so we've been doing experiments in a simulated robot environment like the one on the top, where we including distractors, which means that basically there are objects that are too far away to be reached by the robot, or objects that move randomly. So basically the robot has to learn it's a waste of time to learn to control this kind of objects. And so like in previous work, we have made analysis of the curriculum of learning of the different tasks. And basically, we can already see, like in the robot experiment, that there is some kind of automated curriculum learning and robustness to like active fast recovery after forgetting or after a sensory failure. So for example, on the top left, the different curves, the different colors, they show the acquisition of different tasks across with time. And on the middle graph, you saw basically the evolution of the measure of absolute learning progress for these different tasks. And then on the right graph, you saw the evolution of the selection probabilities of the different tasks that are used by the bandit. And basically what you see is that the blue task is an easy one. It's learned pretty fast. And then the system goes after that to explore and sample the red task, which is pretty easy. And then it goes to the green task, sorry. And then after the green task is mastered, it goes to the yellow task. But then what you observe is that quite quickly, the performance of the green task is deteriorating. And the robot can see that because it is regularly resampling the whole task. It's a bandit, remember? So it's not an on or off. It's like a proportional sampling algorithm. And it is basically detecting there is a drop in the performance and very fast refocusing on this task and relearning it. And typically here, what's happening is that as we use neural networks in the actor-critic architecture, and we train the actor-critic architecture on different tasks, there is natural interference among the tasks, and sometimes there is forgetting due to this natural interference. And so the system is able to very quickly spot this problem and retrain on the spot, if I can say, specifically this problem. And so the other kind of experiment we can do, which is on the bottom, is that, for example, after some time where the robot has learned all the tasks, we can, for example, on purpose damage a sensor. And so we can see whether the performance of the robot is going to be robust to that and to go back to a high performance quite quickly, especially if the sensor damage affects only parts of the task. And this is what you observe here when we show that using learning progress on the goal is more efficient than sampling randomly. So basically, we see here that applying the learning progress-based goal exploration idea to DeepRL can be done, and it has many advantages. And actually, the great advantage that comes from the DeepRL machinery is that there is a relatively good generalization. But the limit is that also shared with DeepRL techniques is that the sampling efficiency, the sample efficiency is pretty low, and the initial discoveries are relatively slow, which is why actually we cannot do at this point in time use such a system in real-world robots. unless actually we combine these two kinds of experiments. And the way to do that is actually to use population-based, intrinsically motivated goal exploration of the kind I showed you with the robot experiment before, early on in the robot learning trajectory, to discover examples of trajectories that produce interesting effect in the environment, and then populate, if I can say, the replay buffer of the goal condition DPRL system with the data coming from this population-based exploration, and progressively then the goal condition policy EMJEPs is going to take over for better generalization. In such a way, it's going to work much better. This is something we began to explore in the paper at ICML 2 years ago. But so now, in what I describe, there are good things, but there are also limitations. One big limitation is that in those experiments, we have assumed we have already a representation of the goal spaces, which is actually quite structured, for example, object-centered. And we have assumed it's already relatively meaningful. Even if, for example, in the robot experiment, we included objects which are unlearnable, still the agent, the robot, could imagine that goals are represented in terms of trajectories of those objects. And so another big fundamental question is how to learn representation of goals and how to also learn goal achievement functions. And so there are basically two approaches that we've explored to do this. I'm going to describe them quickly. The first approach is by using unsupervised representation learning to learn representation of a goal space. So this is work that we began to do in 2018 with population-based approaches, and the basic idea is actually quite simple. We use machines like beta variational autoencoders, which start from the pixels, and so initially we have some kind of baby robot that is observing another machine, another robot, or a social peer moving around in the world, producing effects, and then collecting those images and learning an embedding modular representation. And then from this modular representation, it's going to use subspaces of this embedding to sample goals, and that's going to be quite efficient. And so a similar idea has been extended to learning in an unsupervised learning way goal spaces with DPRL by people in Berkeley, like the Nair et al. Paper and the Pong et al. Paper that were published also recently. So I'm not going to show you many details about that, but what we've been able to show is that at least in simulation, this kind of approach is able to work with multiple objects, including distractors, where basically some of the latent dimensions that are learned correspond to learnable objects, and other latent dimensions are non-controllable objects. And by using the learning progress, the machine is going to be able to discover it's more interesting to sample the latents and to imagine goals in those latents for the controllable object than for the object where there is no learning progress, which are the uncontrollable objects. So another way to say that, you can also see this architecture as a way to discover what are the controllable dimensions of the world by combining learning progress-based exploration with a machine like a beta VIE. Okay. But then there are limitations with such an approach. So first of all, algorithms like beta VIEs are still very brittle and they do not scale to real-world images. The second limitation is that goals are still very simple and there is a low level of abstraction. Another limitation is that goal achievement function in those work, they were basically based on distances in the embedding space. And sometimes it may not be very meaningful. And finally, and I think it's the most important, the generative models in those cases, they learn within distribution representation. They learn basically distributions, representation of the distribution of effects and things they have already seen during their exploration. But what is more interesting for curiosity-driven exploration would be to imagine out of distribution goals. And so this is why actually we have begun to explore another approach, which is relying on language. So basically, for imagining out of distribution goals, children leverage the properties of language. So language enables them to assimilate thousands of years of experience that are embedded in their culture in only a few years. And as children discover language, their goal-driven exploration changes. So for example, Piaget first described this as a form of private or egocentric speech, where children narrate their ongoing activity. And later on, Vygotsky, another famous developmental psychologist, realized that children were not simply narrating what they were doing, but rather generating novel plans and goals by using the expressive generativity of language. And so, interestingly, this generative capability can push the limits of the real. And Chomsky made a few famous examples. For example, like the sentence that is syntactically correct, but semantically strange, like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. But if we take the example of a child, we can see a much more concrete example. So let's see, for example, this child, which is imagining what he could try to draw on a sheet of paper, and he may come with the idea of drawing a cat bus or a dog plane, or for example, to draw how a tree could eat a frog cake. And obviously, he has never seen in his life a dog plane or a cat bus or a tree eating a frog cake. But still, it's very easy for the child to imagine those things by just recombining words. And so that's very powerful for children to imagine out of distribution goals by leveraging the language compositionality. And that's basically what we've been exploring recently in the context of intrinsically motivated machine learning. And so here we have an environment that is procedurally generated at each episode. So that's very simple, but still there is procedural generation at each episode with many types of objects that vary in colors, vary in shapes, and various types of compositional dynamics. So for example, you have animals that can be grown if one brings food to them or water, and you have plants that can only be grown if you bring to them some water. And so here you have an agent that initially tries random things, and there is a social peer who provides linguistic description of what he did in an episode. And so the agent is going to learn the meaning of this description and then reuse them as its own goals in future episodes. So if we summarize this again, so we basically here have a social peer that provides those language descriptions at the end of episodes, and they are chosen from a trend set that the social peer is allowed to take sentences from. But what's quite important to realize is that there is also a test set, and in this test set there are many sentences who describe things which are in theory possible in that world, but that the social peer is not allowed to tell to the agent. And another very important thing to keep in mind is that here we do not have an instruction following agent. There is no instructions like in most of the language-guided higher literature. We have only a social peer who is giving a description at the very end of each episode. And then after this phase where the agent may learn some kind of relation between what he does and some sentences, there is another phase of autonomous exploration. And then in this phase of autonomous exploration, basically the social peer does not speak anymore. But in this phase, the agent continues to sample goals as sentences already uttered by the social peer and to train on them. So far so good, it's not so, it's just normal. But then what is very important is that the agent is now going to invent new out of distribution goals by recombining the words that have been heard from the social peer sentences to form new sentences. He's going to try to guess their meaning and to learn how to achieve the corresponding policy. And so, for example, here on the two first little drawings, you see the agent, the social peer is not there anymore. The agent in the two first drawing is inventing a goal that is already seen, described by the social peer. It's a sentence that the social peer has already heard. But then in the third drawing, we are now in a case where this agent, he has learned several sentences, and from of them he recombined them and he imagined the goal, grow green tree. This has never been pronounced by the social peer, but then he's going to try to achieve that goal. So this is kind of challenging, and so the only way this is going to do something interesting is by solving two challenges. The first challenge is how to imagine new sentences that have a sufficient probability to be meaningful, or at least useful to make some discoveries. So basically here we leverage the construction grammar framework, which has been used to model child language development with pattern imitation and discovery of word equivalence classes. So that is basically something where you discover patterns like pot X on Y and equivalence classes, where you discover that in these slots you can put various kinds of equivalent words. I'm not going to give you details on how this is working, but we can discuss that later on. And then the second very important challenge is how to generalize to out-of-distribution goals. So for example, imagine an agent has learned about the 3 following sentences that you see on the screen: grow red lion, grasp red lion, and grasp a green plant. Then the question is, how is it going to guess the meaning of a sentence like grow green plants, which he has never seen? And so to do that, basically, we will need several ingredients. So there is a first ingredient that is very important, that we have reused from the work of Bardano et al. Last year, and which is basically relying on the idea of learning the meaning of sentences by modeling the rewards associated to these sentences. But actually, if you use this idea just like this with a standard flat neural architecture, it will not work very well. It will not generalize very well. So basically what we did is that we designed an actor-critic architecture, which in addition to using attention and language embedding conditioning, like in Bardano et al., we also use deep sets with affordance-centered representations for the actor and for the policy. And so basically it means there is a network with shared weights that goes over all objects in the scene and takes as input object features, body features, and their difference with the initial state, which is quite important to account for the meaning of verbs. And then all the results are fed to a permutation invariant aggregator, which is here a learned OR function. And so basically, this is the architecture for learning to predict whether a particular sentence is going to be true after a certain behavioral trajectory. And so this can be used as the internal reward function to measure whether an internally generated goal, so a sentence, is achieved, and basically to use that to train goal parameterized policies to learn about those goals. So we've basically experimented with this kind of architecture. And first of all, we've shown that it's very, very important in this kind of architecture to use a modular architecture based on those deep sets for the generalization performance. Here, for example, we compare generalization performance between the architecture using deep sets with an architecture that uses only flat attention, like in previous goal condition RL approaches, and we see it's much better. And we see it's much better not only for the learning the reward function, but also the policy performance. And also we've been looking in more detail at different kinds of different types of generalization that such an architecture enables. And we found actually that it's quite robust to those different kinds. So here, actually, I'm not going to have time to give you details, but I'm sure we can discuss that later on or by email if you're interested. But to come back, what's really key here is that we've been able to implement in the DeepRL framework this general idea I combat here, which I think is quite fundamental. There are many ways we could improve the architecture, but the fundamental idea is basically to use the power of compositionality in language to imagine those out of distribution goals, and then to leverage modular goal parameterized DeepRL architecture to generalize to those out of distribution goals, which leads basically the agent to be able to explore in a much richer way its environment than the sensory motor experiment I presented to you earlier. So I think it seems to me that I'm already over time. I had actually a part of my talk which was about going back to human modeling. So maybe in a few sentences, I can summarize what it is about, but I'm not going to give you any details, just for those of you who might want to discuss with me later on. So first of all, for example, we've shown that the kind of mechanisms I just described, when they're applied to a realistic sensory motor space, they can enable to reproduce the developmental trajectory we observe in human children, for example, the vocal development. So we've shown, for example, that we can reproduce the well-known developmental stages we observe in vocal development using those architecture. And in particular, we can account for the duality between regularities, but also the diversity of individual developmental trajectories. We've done that also on the topic on modeling the development of tool use and different strategies for tool use in human infants, showing that, for example, we can reproduce and predict various qualitative developmental phases we observe in infants. And last but not least, there has been in the last 10 years new experiments with humans that have been made to test some of the prediction about the learning progress hypothesis that have been involving infants and adults in different kinds of tasks, which are perceptual tasks or motor tasks or video games tasks with sensory motor control. And all of them are converging to confirm that humans are using some form of measure of learning progress to guide exploration in the context of free exploration when there is no external reward or external task which is given to them. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop there.
Well, thanks for the talk.